Welcome to your second set of online classes. These next three are going to talk about German fairy tales. Fairy tales come from every country in the world, but they're especially associated with Germany, and we'll find out why a little bit later. So, what is a fairy tale? Think to yourself, how is a fairy tale different from another type of story? Just a regular fiction story that you might read in English or anything like that. How is it different? Okay, so fairy tales are stories that were told over and over again from mother to daughter to son to and so on through the generations. And today it's written down. They take place in a make-believe place usually. They usually have magic or supernatural powers, talking animals, things that really just can't happen. Some characteristics of fairy tales that you see in a lot of fairy tales, but not every fairy tale is going to have every characteristics. So try to remember some of these, because as you watch the fairy tales in the next couple lessons, you'll want to think about which of these characteristics they have in them. Okay, so the first is talking animals. That happens a lot. The next is magic. It can be a different kind of magic, or, talking animals is a kind of magic. There's always a good versus evil kind of theme. There's usually a good character and an evil character, and good usually ends up triumphing over evil. They often have special beginning or ending words. Can you think of any? You might have thought of Once Upon a Time and Happily Ever After. Things often happen in threes or sevens, and you might not think about it that much, but we have the Three Little Pigs, the Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and sometimes things happen like girls, sometimes in Cinderella stories, the girls go to the ball 3 times. So look for that. There's often royalty or castle, but not always. Sometimes they're about common people. There is always a moral or a lesson. The purpose of fairy tales was originally to instruct children how to behave. So the moral is like what you're supposed to learn from it. Because of that, fairy tales didn't always used to have a happy ending, because sometimes the people in it weren't good, or they did bad things, even if they weren't bad people, and they were punished. They were also to entertain, though. So they were to instruct, teach a lesson, but also to entertain people, to tell at night, because they didn't used to have TV or Hulu. Okay, one reason that fairy tales are so associated with Germany is because of these guys, the Brothers Grimm. Their names were Jakob and Wilhelm Grimm. They traveled in Germany and they collected fairy tales by listening and writing them down. They were not the authors. They would go to people's houses, knock on the door, ask if they knew any tales. They would sit and listen, and they would scribe them. And they collected them into books and preserved them for us. Nobody else really did this much in other countries. So this is why Germany has so many fairy tales, and why fairy tales are often thought of as being German. They also wrote the first German dictionary, like Noah Webster did here in the U.S., and they were instrumental in preserving fairy tales for us today. So what are some common fairy tales? What are some fairy tales you can think of? Probably thought of Cinderella. Cinderella is the most common fairy tale in the world. Every single culture like ever on earth has one. There's over 1,000 different versions in the world, and they all have basically the same story, even though some of the details are different. Snow White. Snow White is a very German tale. There's a place in eastern Germany where this is supposed to have taken place, which is near a diamond mine. Obviously, it didn't really, but it does come out of Germany. It's called Schneewittchen. Little Red Riding Hood. Now, Little Red Riding Hood is an example of a story that used to have a more dark ending. I'm going to tell you an original one that I read in my French class in college, and I'm paraphrasing. But it starts out like the regular Red Riding Hood. The girl is going to see Grandma because she's sick, goes to the woods, meets the wolf. The wolf gets her off the path, and she talks to him. Her mother has warned her not to talk to strangers and not to leave the path. So the wolf obviously gets to Grandma's first, but instead of eating Grandma, this wolf takes Grandma, and this is a little gory, so if you're sensitive, watch it. But he takes Grandma and he cuts her up and drains her blood into a glass and puts her on a platter and puts her down in the root cellar where she stays cold, and then pretends to be Grandma. So then Little Red Riding Hood gets there, and she gives Grandma the basket and then says, "Oh, Grandma, that was a long walk through the woods. I am so hungry." So Wolf sits Red Riding Hood down at the table, brings Grandma, who's now cut up on the plate, and serves her to Little Red Riding Hood. Little Red Riding Hood eats up, not knowing it's her grandma, her actual grandma. And now she's all nice and fattened up, and the wolf eats her too. Or now the wolf eats her. This wolf didn't eat grandma. So now the wolf has eaten Little Red Riding Hood. And this is the part of the story normally where he's eaten both of them, and the woodcutter comes by and slits them open, and they jump out, and everything's okay, and Little Red has learned her lesson. So this version is obviously going to be different. What do you think happens? Take a second and think. What do you think? The answer is nothing. Nothing happens. Granny and Little Red Riding Hood have been killed by the wolf, and nothing happens because Little Red Riding Hood didn't listen to her parents. She talked to a stranger. She wandered off the path. So in real life, if you do those things, is everything always going to have a happy ending for you? And the answer, of course, is no. So that is why they were sometimes darker, because they were used to instruct as well and to teach lessons. Hansel and Gretel is another very German fairy tale. And two fairy tales you're going to see in the next couple lessons are Mother Holle, or I think they call it Mother Hulda. This is very German. In fact, I've hardly ever had any kids that have heard of it before, so that might be interesting for you to see a new one. This is similar to a fairy tale you know, so when you're watching it, see if you can figure out which fairy tale it's kind of similar to, and think about which characteristics it has and what lesson you're supposed to learn from it. Another very German fairy tale is The Pied Piper of Hamelin. The one you're going to see is an early Disney version of it, and it doesn't have a lot of dialogue. What is there is kind of sung slowly, so you will have to definitely pay attention to that. And again, see if you can figure out what are the characteristics of fairy tales that this meets, and what's the moral of the story that goes on. At the end of the third lesson, you're then going to take a little quiz for me. It's really kind of a worksheet on Google Docs. So feel free to use any of the resources. If you even want to take any notes, you can. You don't have to. You're not going to turn them in. But you can use those during this little quiz, because it's not like you have to study for a quiz. It's just a kind of a worksheet on Google Docs. So I hope you enjoy the videos that you'll see in the next couple of lessons. And make sure to go back and see if you can answer the questions I've asked you. And if not, you can look through this again. Tschüss.